Thanks so much, Tim, and thank you for having me. So I know I've only got 10 minutes, and as you said, Tim, we are newly listed on the ASX. So really what I want to do today is give viewers just a bit of a sort of snapshot of who Argenica is and what we're trying to do and what the sort of the roadmap looks like for the next 12 to 18 months. So as you said, we are newly listed and we are looking to develop best-in-class novel neuroprotective therapeutics. So these therapeutics will provide protection to brain cells following stroke and other types of brain injury. So these brain cells are usually irreparably damaged following stroke or other brain injury. So we're looking to protect those brain cells. The project itself has been in development for over 6 years with significant capital spend through external grants as well as philanthropic funding. Our lead candidate is ARG007, and it has shown evidence of efficacy in multiple models of stroke and other types of brain injury. So through our IPO, we raised $7 million, and we will use that money to advance our phase 1 clinical trial and commence our phase 2 clinical trial. Next slide, please. Thanks. So this is our capital structure at IPO. So we had a market cap of 14.6 mil, and you can see a number of shares there in escrow for either 12 months or 24 months. We're sitting around the 15.7 market cap today with a share price of 24 cents. Next slide, please. So we've got some key investment highlights. So what we are trying to do is solve a huge unmet clinical need. There are currently no drugs on the market that provide protection to brain cells following stroke, and Argenica hopes to be just one of a handful of companies that address this unmet need. As I said, our lead candidate ARG007 has been in development for over 6 years, and we've got fantastic preclinical data showing the efficacy of our drug in not only stroke but other types of brain injury. We've got a really experienced board and management team with both capital markets experience as well as drug development commercialization experience, and a really clear clinical pathway to get our lead candidate through to phase 1 and on to phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we are addressing a huge unmet need, and the opportunity that we're looking at is projected to be a stroke treatment of around $183 billion US dollars by 2030. So around 15 million people suffer a stroke every year globally, and with 5 million people that die of stroke. The most common type of stroke is an ischemic stroke. So around 85% of people that suffer stroke will have an ischemic stroke. Ischemic stroke is caused by a clot in the blood vessels in the brain. There are currently, as I said, no drugs on the market that protect brain cells following stroke. So any type of stroke, including ischemic stroke. So we are looking to develop and commercialize our lead candidate to address this market need. Next slide, please. So why is neuroprotection so important following stroke? Stroke is one of the leading causes of death and disability worldwide, and it generates a huge economic burden on the healthcare system. When somebody has a stroke or other type of brain injury, brain cells suffer significant damage, which is often irreparable. And the time to treatment is absolutely critical. So we know that the brain ages around 3.6 years for every hour that treatment is delayed. The current stroke therapies only address the underlying cause of the stroke. So for an ischemic stroke, which is caused by that blood clot in the blood vessels in the brain, the treatment at the moment really looks to remove that clot. So that's either done by a procedure called a mechanical thrombectomy, which surgically removes the clot, or by administering a drug, which dissolves the clot. And that drug is called alteplase or TPA. Next slide, please. So just to show you a current sort of stroke treatment and then where our lead candidate hopes to play in this. So currently when somebody has a stroke, paramedics arrive and determine that that person has suffered a stroke, and the in-field triage that paramedics can do is reasonably limited. So their whole goal is to get that patient to a stroke care unit at a hospital as soon as possible. Now, when patients arrive at the hospital, it's really important that the type of stroke that they have is diagnosed. So either an ischemic stroke, or the other type of main type of stroke is a hemorrhagic stroke, which is caused by a bleed on the brain. Now, the reason this is so important, because if the clot dissolving drug, that TPA drug, is given to a patient that's had a hemorrhagic stroke, it can exacerbate the bleeding of those stroke patients and even result in death. So once it's determined that someone's had an ischemic or a hemorrhagic stroke, the treatment for ischemic stroke, as I said, is either to remove the clot surgically through a mechanical thrombectomy, or to administer TPA, the clot dissolving drug. But you can see that all in that delay of getting diagnosis and treatment, the brain is still deprived of oxygen because of the clot, and that you get increasing levels of neuronal cell death and damage in the brain, which leads to long-term functional disability for stroke patients. Next slide, please. So what we're hoping to do is to be able to administer our lead candidate, ARG-007, at the point of paramedics arriving, so in the field. So this will give patients greater time to reach hospital and to receive treatment. So our lead candidate, ARG-007, acts as a neuroprotector. So it protects the brain cells from dying. So it delays the amount of cell death seen in these patients, thereby reducing the amount of cell death and improving the amount of functional recovery in these patients. Next slide, please. So what our data shows is that in animal models, so we've done extensive preclinical work in animal models to show that ARG-007 reduces the amount of infarct volume. Now, infarct volume is the volume of cell death that is actually seen in the brain. So we can see after 24 hours post-stroke, ARG-007 is significantly reducing that amount of cell death. And we've compared this to our nearest competitor, NA1, which is currently in phase 3 clinical trials. And we've shown that this effect of neuroprotection from ARG-007 lasts significantly post-stroke. So we've done up to 28 days after that stroke, and that neuroprotection still remains. Next slide, please. So importantly, what we've also shown is that within a hemorrhagic stroke model, ARG-007 does not exacerbate bleeding. So this means that it can be given to a patient before diagnosis, so in the field by the paramedics immediately. So it can start working to protect brain cells as soon as a stroke has occurred. Next slide, please. So Argenica is following a very standard drug development pathway. So we're at in the process of completing our preclinical studies required for our phase 1 clinical trial. A phase 1 clinical trial is a trial to look at the safety and tolerability of a drug in healthy subjects. So we will do this trial first before we move on to our phase 2 trial, which will look at the efficacy of ARG-007 in patients that have suffered a stroke, and then move on to a larger efficacy trial in our phase 3 trial. Next slide, please. So this just outlines our development pathway over the next sort of 12 to 18 months. So we are in the process of optimizing our GMP manufacturing. So that's our good manufacturing practice. So that's the type of drug that we need to move into our clinical trials. We've recently released some preliminary PK or pharmacokinetic data, and we'll complete those studies middle of Q3. We are also about to embark on our safety and toxicology studies in non-human primates. So this will be completed just before we initiate our phase 1 clinical trial, which will be initiated towards the end of this calendar year in Q4. We'll look at first patient dosing soon after that and have preliminary results from our phase 1 clinical trial towards the beginning of Q2 2022. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we've got a really experienced board and management team. So our non-executive chairman, Jeff Pocock, who has extensive experience in capital markets, is a non-exec on Osteopore, Envision, and was a former co-founder and managing director of Hazer. Jeff is joined by Dr. Samantha South, Liddy McCaw, and Terry Budge on the board, and myself as the CEO, and we're joined by Emma Walton as our company secretary. Next slide, please. And we are fortunate to be joined by leading research and clinical teams. So our Chief Scientific Officer, Professor Bruno Maloney, has over 20 years of experience in stroke research. And he is joined by our clinical lead, Professor Neville Nucky, who has a fantastic experience of both neurosurgery as well as research. So they are leading the research efforts for Argenica. And our clinical advisory committee, who is advising the company on the structure of our clinical trials, so led by Dr. David Blacker as the chairman, Professor Jeffrey Donnan, Paul Bailey and Dr. Tim Phillips, who all have extensive experience running clinical trials in stroke, with both David and Jeff involved currently in our nearest competitor, Nono, who've got the NA1 drug in their phase 3 clinical trial. Next slide, please. So just some key takeaways before I finish up. So we're a really well-structured business, really robust capital position and currently well priced. Huge commercial opportunity to address that unmet need in stroke patients, and really value enhancing milestones coming through in the next 12 months, which is really exciting. So that's it. Thank you very much, Tim.
Thanks, Liz. A couple of questions here.
Yep.
We've seen a number of biotech companies recently that are focusing on unmet needs kind of get fast-tracked designation from the FDA. Is that something you're looking to push?
Yeah, we can definitely look at that fast track designation, and that's sort of if you're not sort of familiar with the process, something that you apply for. So every biotech has the opportunity to apply for and look at it on its merits. So it's definitely a key strategy for most biotechnology companies.
And to get to this stage, it's probably taken 6 years by the sounds of things. You've spent some significant dollars. Your funding channels to date have been external. You've had grants and some philanthropic funding. Can you give us a few more details on who's supported you this far?
Yeah, so look, generally the way, because it's come out of a research institute, so the majority of funding does come from NH and MRC grants, so they are federal grants. And then the parent institute has significant philanthropic funding as well. So a number of those philanthropic donors are actually some of our early stage investors into the company as well. So mainly high net worths that have a connection to neurological conditions.
And you've spoken about administrating your drug in the field before the stroke type has been determined. We've had a couple of companies on the webinar previously, EMV Vision and MicroX, who are developing kind of portable brain scanners to help determine the strokes in the field. Is this sort of technology going to help you in any way?
It's all fantastic. The sooner that you can diagnose stroke, and if you can do that in the ambulance, then you can triage that patient in the hospital quicker, right? So it's going to come through that the interventional radiologist will know that patient has had an ischemic stroke, so they can go straight into surgery. So that's fantastic to reduce the time, but because our drug can be delivered regardless of the type of stroke, it doesn't actually really matter for us. And I think it's all complementary, right? It's all about getting the patient to the right treatment as soon as possible. But really what our drug is trying to do is to buy that patient time and to protect their brain cells as much as possible before they receive the treatment.
And is this question here, is the ultimate aim of the drug to be administered for immediately after trauma, like a car accident or rugby concussion, or is it just kind of, does it have additional uses post-stroke use?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got preclinical data in traumatic brain injury as well as perinatal hypoxia. So they're the two avenues that we're looking to build upon with some of this funding through the IPO. So traumatic brain injury, which is more sort of aligned to something like a car accident, is what we're looking at. Concussion is a mild traumatic brain injury, and they're sort of quite different neurological models. So we're looking at both both of them. If you think about concussion in a sporting injury, you know, that occurs multiple times over a player's professional career. So we're looking at, you know, what would be the right kind of dose, what would be the right kind of formulation if we can build it into, say, a nasal spray or an oral formulation where a player can take that as soon as it's sustained a concussion, and potentially a lower dose if they're going to have chronic use of the drug as well. So all those sorts of things is what we're looking at to explore over the next 12 months as well.